While we are working on our technical problems, I am going to read one of 3 excerpts this week from, we have it here. We actually just yesterday got a copy of the actual book in hand, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. And man, this just feels really, really good to have this after, depending on how you count, months of waiting, years of waiting, well over a decade in the making. So like we said, the penultimate chapter of the book is Culture and Consciousness, and we are going to share 3 excerpts from it today. And still, I basically wanted to read all of it, but we're not doing that. So let us begin. Let us begin with definitions. These will not precisely match others' definitions, but it is important on this topic to have stated what we are talking about. For our purposes, culture we define as beliefs and practices that are shared and passed between members of a population. These beliefs are often literally false, metaphorically true, implying that they result in increased fitness if one acts as if they are true despite the fact that they are either inaccurate or unfalsifiable. Culture is a special mode of transmission because it can be passed horizontally, rendering cultural evolution immensely faster and more nimble than genetic evolution. This also renders culture noisy in the short term, before new ideas have endured the test of time. Long-standing features of culture, by contrast, constitute an efficient packaging of proven patterns. Culture can spread horizontally, but its consequential parts are ultimately passed vertically from generation to generation. Culture is received wisdom, generally handed to you by ancestors and officially transmitted. Consciousness we define, as we laid out in the very first chapter of the book, as that portion of cognition that is newly packaged for exchange, meaning that conscious thoughts are ones that could be delivered if someone asked you what you were thinking about. It is emergent cognition, where innovation and rapid refinement occur. Conscious thoughts may never be conveyed, but they can be, and the most important ones are, as consciousness is most fundamentally a collective process in which many individuals pool insights and skills to discover what was previously not understood. The products of consciousness are, if they prove useful, ultimately packaged into highly transmissible culture. We have said before in the book that the human niche is niche switching. More specifically, we argue that the human niche is to move between the paired inverse modes of culture and consciousness. As an example, let us consider the Nez Perce people, who have lived in the Pacific Northwest for many thousands of years. Since they arrived, they have inhabited a rich land, and they now have well-established cultural rules that keep them safe and thriving. Their diet has long included bulbs, the storage organs of plants, which do not want to be eaten. On these lands where the Nez Perce came to live, both camas, with highly nutritious bulbs, and death camas, with bulbs that are toxic, grow. When not in flower, these bulbs are incredibly difficult to tell apart. The Nez Perce may not have been the first on this land, but someone was, and those first people could not benefit from names that would make the danger clear. Yet they learned the distinction, presumably through trial and error. It was likely a messy, tragic process. By the 19th century, however, when Spaniards were documenting what they saw among the Nez Perce, the system of distinguishing nutritious camas from their deadly relatives was nearly perfect. This is culture. When humans are exploiting a well-understood opportunity, like 19th century Nez Perce distinguishing camas from death camas, culture is king. But when novelty renders ancestral wisdom inadequate, as it was for the more ancient ancestral Nez Perce upon arrival in the Pacific Northwest, we need to shift to consciousness. Through parallel processing of multiple human minds, our consciousness can become collective, and we can solve problems that neither we could solve as individuals nor ancestors could have even imagined. Put another way, in times of stability, when inherited wisdom allows individuals to prosper and spread across relatively homogeneous landscapes, culture reigns. But in times of expansion into new frontiers, when innovation and interpretation and communication of new ideas are critical, consciousness reigns. That said, novel levels of novelty, such as we are experiencing now, are a special danger. This means that what is needed today, and urgently, is a call to consciousness on a scale that we have not seen before. So that's our first excerpt for today. And we are back in business here, tech-wise.
Well, let's treat it as if it works, and if not, we will resort to other cameras.
Indeed.
So I'm really excited that this model is in the world. We have talked about it at least once publicly before. We talked about it on a discussion with Robbie George, a talk for Princeton.
In the spring of last year.
But I do think that humans are, as my advisor Dick Alexander famously said, the uniquely unique species. And the question really is, what is it about humans that allows us to be uniquely unique? And I believe that this model is a strong contributor to the difference. So just to flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah.
People will recognize that when we say, something like, what is a tufted titmouse, right? We're talking about a particular species. And
as people remarkably do occasionally say to us.
Well, sure.
Yes.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
What is a tufted titmouse?
What is a tufted titmouse?
We're not going to answer that question here today.
A tufted titmouse is just a stand-in for any species. And in general, if you ask what a species is, it comes with a description of a niche. Each species has some set of things that it does, and it can be a very broad generalist niche. A raccoon has a very generalist niche. It does a lot of different things, and
Mountain
it does
lion.
them all a little poorly. Mountain lion
Crows.
is a little different. Mountain lion, different populations will exploit different kinds of prey, and so depending upon the habitat, they may look very different. But for human beings, it's very hard to specify what the niche is, because if you look at all of the various things that people do, it's tremendously variable. And if you look at all of the things that people have done while we have been fully modern people, it's even more variable.
It's even more variable. In some ways, in many ways, we're becoming a more homogeneous species.
Right. In some ways, we are becoming more homogeneous. But obviously, if a modern human, that is to say, the physical being, can be teleported into any one of those niches and can function well so long as it develops there and picks up the correct programming to function, that suggests something very bizarre about us, which is that we are somehow a creature that upgrades our own software. And that does not mean improves it. It means radically swaps out one set of software at the point that you change what it is that you're eating and what sorts of hostile forces you're facing, switches out the software en masse in order to replace it with a software package that has been bootstrapped for the new local circumstances and is an amazing capacity. So how the hell do we do it?
How do we do it? And Dick Alexander had a different, a somewhat different, although not in conflict with, I would say, this model of oscillating forces, oscillating selective forces, right? That we were striving against effectively ecology, so-called Darwin's hostile forces, things like weather and climate and predators and parasites, and obviously we still have to contend with those things. Those things are in the news now, right? And then there was also the effectively social competition that we became our biggest competitors.
We became our most dominant competitor. Yeah. And so
we became our own most dominant.
Yes. So yeah, these things aren't in conflict at all. And in fact,
so that's Dick's model, and then our model is
this culture and consciousness. But I should just say Dick's model has to precede ours, because Dick's model is really an explanation for why the human brain got so disproportionately large. Right. And it had to do with an arms race between human lineages that caused lineages that could outthink their competitors to win. And basically we all inherited this greatly enlarged thinking apparatus. But not only is it an enlarged thinking apparatus, it is a thinking apparatus that is not heavily pre-programmed. It is somewhat pre-programmed. We are not blank slates, but it is not fully pre-programmed. And that means there's room to swap in an agriculturalist, high altitude agriculturalist program if you're, farming corn in the Andes. Or you could swap in a marine mammal hunting program if you were, hunting whales in the Arctic. And right. That's a radically different way of being. And it requires very different programming.
Exactly. And so, we are, and as we say in the book, we are not blank slates, but we are, of all the species on the planet, the blankest slates. And we are blanker even than our two closest extant relatives, that is the two species on the planet to which we are most closely related. We are equally related to chimps and bonobos. And they are interestingly quite different from one another. But I don't think it's ever been tried, but a prediction behind which I would stand and put a lot of money is that if you try to cross-foster a bonobo with a chimp family or a chimp with a bonobo family, the chimpiness will persist in the chimp raised with bonobos, and the bonoboishness will persist in the bonobo raised with chimps. Whereas if you cross-foster any human being in any other human culture, so long as you start at infancy, basically all of the things of the family in which the baby has been cross-fostered will come on board. obviously melanin isn't going to change, and facial shape. Although even some things like face shape will change as a result of diet, as we've talked about
diet
before.
And different, you could at least have different facial expressions. Obviously, there's huge overlap, but
exactly. But the language will be different, and the cultural, the memes and the expressions and the expectations, and therefore, to some degree, the periodicity and the timing of events. Babies who are raised with a lot of love, but in very restrained physical situations, among the Tajik, for instance, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, walk really late compared to weird babies. Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic society bred weird babies, whereas some babies in Kenya, where it's the encouragement is to move a lot very early, they walk earlier. And you could take a Tajik baby and raise it in that Kenyan village, and that Tajik baby would walk earlier. This is not in the genetic layer; it's in the software layer.
It's in the software layer, and it is both the fact of the software layer, which, a lot of this will be familiar in one regard or another to people who've been watching and listening to us, but the software layer is every bit as biological. It is a different way of transmitting information. It is transmitted outside of the genome, but it is not less biological. And we argue, I think persuasively in the book, that it is subject to the objectives of the genome. And so the question is, how does a genome that is trying to get into the future and doesn't really care about how, it doesn't care about in what form or through what behaviors, upgrade its software program so that it can take advantage of whatever opportunities it encounters along the way? And so we argue for this oscillating set of modes, one which you use when you figured out how to behave in a particular habitat, and one which you use when you have to figure out how to behave in a new habitat, whether that's because your old habitat changed or because you've moved or because you live at the edge of a habitat where your ancestral population developed its insight. And it is this ability which, the key thing is that human beings can do something that no other creature can do. We can actually faithfully transmit an abstract idea across open air from one mind to another. And that allows us to do something that no other creature can do, which is to pool insight and get an emergent conclusion that is superior to the sum of the individual conclusions that different people would have if forced to calculate independently.
So let's just forestall an objection I see, which is that there are at least proto-linguistic things, proto-linguistic communications in some other organisms in which information is being conveyed. But in no other species is information being conveyed with the level of both accuracy and precision that we can convey it. Language is several steps beyond what anyone else has. And so, when we were in college, I remember learning about actually Cheney and Seyfarth's early work with, is it vervets? I think it's vervet monkeys, who have 3 different vocalizations for the 3 broad types of predators that they are at risk from. So they have a different vocalization for an aerial predator, and is to say a predatory bird that might be coming, or a terrestrial, basically a mammal like a big cat, and then also for snakes. Snakes and cats, which are both a risk for vervet monkeys, come differently. They can move differently. They really do require a different kind of response if you are going to maximize the likelihood that you escape from it. And so, they have 3 very different vocalizations, suggesting an understanding of their environment that is rich and involved and detailed and accurate, and they can convey that information, but they don't seem to be conveying much beyond this thing is here. Danger of one of 3 sorts.
Yeah,
right?
It is a pre-existing agreement on the meaning of an arbitrary signal. Which is very different from an abstraction. And just if you haven't been through the logic before, the fact that one can say something that one can be reasonably sure is novel, right? If I say potato-bearing conifer, right? Probably that's not a useful enough thought that anyone will have bothered to try it out. But if I say it, and then I was to ask you to draw a picture, we could establish that I had successfully conveyed it over open air because you draw a pine tree with a potato growing off it or something like that, right? That
I'm not sure to what end, but I could do it.
To no useful end except that we have established that, in fact, we are not kidding ourselves, that we are transmitting abstract thoughts between our minds, that we are actually succeeding in doing it. I mean, you could
and not just transmitting, right? So, this is one of the frequent concerns about the many ape language studies that have gone on, where many apes seem to be able to demonstrate receptive language and to be able to some degree to use combinatorics to convey somewhat new ideas. But that second thing is what is often called into question. The idea that you can understand that another species of ape, as we are, could understand language, and of course they're working at a disadvantage, not just linguistic, but because we are framing things in the world that makes the most sense to us. They're working with the handicap that we have handed to them, assuming that they are like us, and of course they are in many ways, but they will not be in some others. But how capable are they actually of innovating new combinations with the pieces that we have handed them? Unclear. And certainly not as capable as we are.
Right. By far not. There is a famous example. I mean, and the problem is any single example could be explained as dumb luck. But I think the example is from Coco the gorilla, who knew a symbol for bird and knew a symbol for water and described duck as water bird, right? That suggests the combinatorics, but it doesn't nail it down. But in our case, the point is transmitting an abstract idea is the first step to something that is really the whole point of the exercise. If I can transmit an abstract idea about a problem I have seen or a solution I have imagined, and then you can run it through your separate mind with your separate skills and without my blind spots, then we can recombine what we have both come up with. And that's where the emergent value comes from.
And that also reveals that the first individual to be expressing a new idea maybe doesn't need this, but it will be helped, and there will be a greater chance that they will want to make the attempt to convey something in the first place if they have theory of mind. So I would say theory of mind, which we know to be already present in apes and baboons, which are not apes but are old world monkeys, to a large degree. If you don't have theory of mind and you therefore imagine that everything else sees the world exactly as you do, to what end conveying new things, right? The fact that you have an idea in your head may feel like, okay, so I assume she knows that as well. So theory of mind would seem to be a sort of implicit base layer as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, at some level, I think even a shared language makes theory of mind so utterly inherent, right? If I'm talking to you and I say, grocery store, right? I know exactly what you put together. Maybe I can't paint the identical picture, but whether you imagine a bodega or a supermarket, it doesn't matter. I know that it lands in a certain quadrant. And if I speak to somebody who speaks Mandarin and I say, grocery store, I don't know that they pick up anything, right? Because I just don't know whether that word will even register as a familiar one. Now, maybe it does. Maybe that's one of the words that is crossed over. But the point is, theory of mind, a shared language is a almost impossibly complex shared theory of mind inherently.
Indeed.
And anyway, it creates the basis for overcoming obstacles extremely rapidly, right? Think about what evolution has to overcome if it functions at a genetic level in order to innovate the tools necessary to hunt a new kind of prey, right? Unless it's very like an old kind of prey, it's going to take a long time for the program to be modified at a genetic level. Whereas it can be modified in hours if people get into conversation about, here's what we're doing, here's why it doesn't work, and here's what we might do that would fix it, right? That's a very rich conversation. And basically it turns evolution onto an extreme form of fast forward, which is the reason that human beings don't have a niche, is that we're actually better off without one, because it means if we happen onto a niche, we can figure out what to do with it.
So we're constantly happening upon new niches through spatial exploration and creating new niches through technological innovation and the like. And therefore, over time, we find new niches as well. So, and you already invoked this, but, traveling across space and time, we are able to deal with the new niches that we are either finding ourselves in or creating for ourselves better than any other species on the planet, but not quite good enough to deal with the rapid change that we are creating on the planet today.